Thanks, Joel. The first time I became aware of Barack Obama, it was here at Channel 11 when the Senate primary campaign was just getting underway. One of our producers was talking about a candidate with a funny name, not much money, but with a fascinating life story who could end up attracting some attention. Did he ever? You know his views when it comes to politics. Tonight, more of the personal side of Illinois' newest senator, Barack Obama, on the Friday Night Show.
My father was a foreign student, born and raised in a small village in Kenya. He grew up herding goats, went to school.
When Barack Obama spoke at the Democratic Convention, the rest of the country noticed the charisma that Illinois voters had already become familiar with. His memoir chronicles how his father abandoned 2-year-old Barack and his mother in Hawaii to accept a Harvard scholarship. After his mother married a man from Indonesia, 6-year-old Barry, as he was known then, moved to that country with his family. But by the age of 10, he was back in Hawaii. His mother wanted him to get a better education than Indonesia could offer. After going to Occidental College in Los Angeles and eventually graduating from Columbia University in New York, Obama worked in a Manhattan financial consulting firm. His next move was to Chicago as a community organizer, working for social change in the city's public housing. 4 years later, he was accepted at Harvard Law School, where he became the first African-American editor of the prestigious Harvard Law Review. He returned to Chicago, met and married Michelle Robinson, raising 2 children in their South Side home while moving from a law firm to the Illinois State Senate in 1997. And now, as he becomes familiar with his first job in Washington, the entire nation is quickly getting to know him, thanks to a whirlwind of network TV appearances, like this one with David Letterman.
Have you met the president? You must know the president.
Well, you know, he called me. He was very gracious after the election. He gave me a call, and we both agreed that we had married up. And then he invited me over to the White House, and we had breakfast with Dick Cheney and Karl Rove, and it was a real fun time.
Yeah, it sounds like. Yeah, it sounds like Mardi Gras.
Nice to have you with us. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here, Bob. Thank you.
I watched you on Letterman, and you seemed very calm, cool, comfortable. Were you inside?
You know, I was certainly cool because they kept the set freezing, but it was a wonderful time. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Have you always been pretty good in front of people in those situations?
Yeah, you know, I don't find myself too nervous. Part of it may have to do with teaching for the last 12 years. I teach constitutional law, or taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago, and nothing will give you a cold sweat quicker than standing in a room of 60 really smart law students who have actually done the reading and may ask you things that you don't know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Your political advisor, David Axelrod, says that you're comfortable wherever you go because of your background. Black father from Kenya, your mom from Kansas, you grew up in Hawaii, your sister is Indonesian. But isn't that exactly what made you so uncomfortable for many years? The fact that you didn't fit in, you didn't have an identity of your own. You had many identities, but you didn't have one.
Yeah. Well, you know, I certainly think that coming from such a diverse background, that as a child and then especially as a teenager, I had a lot of work to do because a lot of people have the benefit of growing up in one place. Maybe their grandparents grew up there. The people around them are all like them and very familiar. And you know, I was moving around a lot, had a lot of different cultural forces impacting me. And so what it meant was that I had to stitch together an identity and sense of self in a way that I don't think is typical. Fortunately, I had a lot of love from my mother and my grandparents and some wonderful friends and teachers who helped shape me. And so coming out of that, coming out on the other side of that, I think it actually made me stronger and able to say that I do have these pieces of everybody in me, and I think that helps me not only in my work but also helps me hopefully be a better father and a better husband and a better neighbor.
You mentioned your mom, your grandparents. Right. You also had a stepfather who helped raise you. Omitted there, for folks who don't know, is your father who, as we mentioned, abandoned the family when you were 2. He was later killed in an automobile accident.
Right.
That's got to be rough because you don't have a father. You're in high school there in Hawaii, and admittedly, Hawaii is a little more liberal, perhaps, but kids can be cruel. And was there some of this business of, well, you know, you're too black for the white kids, you're too white for the black kids? Was there some of that?
Well, you know, in Hawaii, in some ways I was lucky, I think, because it would have been much tougher in a real racially polarized city like Chicago was certainly during the 70s and still to some degree is. In Hawaii, folks are mixed up enough that the racial component of it wasn't as stark as it might have been. I think that what I write about in my book is the fact that I was going through, in some ways, what I think a lot of African American youth go through, particularly males, if they don't have a father figure at home. They're trying to figure out, well, what does it mean to be a black man in America? And the images that are being projected are not a particularly good menu of choices, right? So you know, I joke about the fact that in the 70s, if you were watching TV, the choices you had were Superfly or Geraldine. You know, remember Flip Wilson's cross-dressing character, and you know, if I had to choose between those two, then Superfly was a little more appealing. And so I think those kinds of struggles were typical for a lot of kids, but I think obviously for me it was a little more exaggerated because of the fact that I was in a place like Hawaii where I was removed from a lot of African American men who were going to work every day and doing a good job raising their families.
When I read your own accounts of your high school days in Hawaii, a lot of drinking, smoking, carrying on, brawling. You were sort of a swaggering rebel.
Right.
And I thought, well, you know what? In my high school, you would have been known as a hood. A hoodlum.
That's basically it. In fact, I think my mother referred to me as such at one point. You know,
except for the basketball, because the hoods didn't engage in sports too much, and you really got into that, didn't you?
And I was a pretty good jock. So and I always was able to at least fake my way through school well enough that you know I could get into college. But there's no doubt that you know there was a lot of turmoil going on there, and part of the reason I write about that in my book, a lot of people ask me subsequently, well, why did you put all that stuff in there? You know, and it's important for me, I think, to show that some of the traps that I fell into and some of the self-destructive behavior that I engaged in is not unique to the kids that you see on the South Side or the West Side, that a lot of us are vulnerable to it, but also that you can pull yourself out of it. You can pull yourself out of it by at some point recognizing that, you know, the pain that you're feeling is not unique, and that there's a larger world out there, and that part of what your task is to take responsibility for your own life, and then hopefully to be able to help take responsibility for making the world outside yourself a little bit better. And that's, I think, how I eventually was able to pull myself out of that.
Who or what was responsible for that turnaround?
Yeah, it's hard for me to say exactly. I mean, I think it was an accumulation of things. Keep in mind that my mother was always a steady presence in my life, and I think the values that she had instilled in me were there even during these difficult times, maybe under the surface, but still there to reemerge when I had grown up a little bit. I had some wonderful professors in school when I got to college who started giving me a hard time, saying, you know, you don't fool us, you actually enjoy reading books, don't you? And why don't you try to apply yourself a little bit? And I think that made a big difference. And then I think my father's death, which happened about halfway through college, also woke me up a little bit, because you know, one of the things that I realized during that time, but certainly by the time that I wrote the book, was that part of what I was doing was in a battle with him and angry with him and trying to figure out why he had left and what was going on there. And I think that his passing away made me have to dig deep and reflect on not only my own life, but also his life, and that's part of the genesis of the book.
So, as far as learning life lessons, important life lessons, did that really begin with your father's death?
You know, I think it's at that point where I got disciplined and I got serious, and I realized that, you know, I might not choose the world that I'm born into, but I certainly have choices in terms of how I engage the world. And I think that that process of getting serious about my place in the world, what kind of positive impact I could have on it, led me to buckle down in terms of my work. It led me to be able to start thinking about how I could make a contribution. I started getting much more involved in student activism in college. It's part of what led me into community organizing and ultimately brought me here to Chicago. And I think Chicago was the place where I think I fully grew up, because working in low-income neighborhoods in the south side of Chicago with people who were much older than I was and had a lot more to complain about than I ever might complain about. I think all that converged to give me a sense of strength that you know, I think is carried on to this day.
Of course, it probably was helpful that you could relate to the groups of kids wandering around aimlessly, joyriding, carrying on.
Right. Now the difference is I think that, you know, the kids in Chicago have a much smaller margin for error. I mean, if I had been in the same place psychologically and mentally growing up here in Chicago, I could have ended up in jail or worse. And that's what happens to so many of the young African American and Latino men in this city. They've got as much talent as I do, they've got as much potential, but if they make a mistake, they don't recover from it, because the pit that they can fall into in a big city like Chicago is so much deeper than the ones that I fell into.
Until your days at Columbia University, you were Barry Obama.
Right.
You went back to your given name, Barack, at that time. Why did you do that?
You know, part of it, I think, was just honoring my father. I mean, I think part of it was saying, reaffirming that there was some connection there. You know, it was his name as well. You know, I'm Barack Obama II, and I think that saying to him in some fashion, even though he wasn't here, that he was my father, and that connection to Kenya was important to me, I think was signified in that name.
Sounds like you grew up fast.
Yeah, well, you know, it didn't seem fast at the time, but you know, I also think that there, you know, when I came to Chicago, I started to, because I was organizing with church groups, I think started to reflect a lot more on my faith. And you know, I wasn't raised in a explicitly religious family. I mean, we'd go to church on Easter, but I think engaging with people who took their faith seriously and reflecting how they could take their faith and exercise it in the world in some meaningful way, I think was helpful to me, because, you know, when I think about how I've been able to navigate a lot of stuff in my life, then I tend to think that, you know, I have received a lot of blessings, and I'm grateful for them.
But even at that point in your life, when you did come to Chicago, you had grown up a bit. You wrote something interesting in your book about those days on the South Side as a community organizer. You referred to yourself as a reluctant skeptic, doubtful of your own motives, having too many quarrels with God to accept a salvation too easily won. Now, this sounds like a very frustrated guy, and for somebody who everyone says, and I know it's true, has a great sense of humor now, man, could you lighten up back then or not?
You know, I was very serious. You know, when I was in New York in my last couple years of college, you know, my mother used to tease me and call me Gandhi, you know, because I had like I had 2 plates and 2 towels, and didn't have a television set.
Minimalist.
I mean, I was just an ascetic, and but part of it was, I think, having to kind of burn off a lot of excess that I'd gone through. I went through my wild times when I was in high school, and I think I overcompensated by just becoming deadly serious during those late college years and my the years that I was organizing, and I would. People would invite me to parties, and I'd say, "What are you talking about? We've got a revolution, that has to
one of
take
those
place."
guys, huh?
Just real, way too somber. And I think that, as I got more comfortable with who I was, and ended up, I think, recognizing that you're not going to survive for the long haul if you're concerned about issues of justice and social change, if you don't have a sense of humor, because it's hard work, and stuff doesn't happen overnight, and you're going to have ups and downs, and if you can't step back from it and say, life is still good, and enjoy a cup of coffee with a friend or take a long walk and soak it in, then you're probably not going to survive it. Now, my wife also helped, because when I finally met her, she insisted that I buy myself a couple of new shirts. She was just tired of seeing those 2 shirts that I'd been wearing for the last 10 years.
I found it more than a little ironic that in the book you talk about the Harold Washington years, the 80s in Chicago, and you found it silly at the time that people were so starstruck around Mayor Washington, trying to get their picture taken with him, and instead of bending his ear on a serious agenda. And now you're in that role now. People are all at Twitter around you.
Yeah, it's a curious thing. I loved Harold Washington. I mean, he was such a larger-than-life figure, and for a young African American, being in this city and just watching how much he meant to the African Americans in this city, but also progressives all across the city, was a wonderful thing. But I was very serious about the work that I was trying to do, and so I would organize these meetings with community residents and tell them, okay, now you've got to remind him, what's he going to do about getting more city services in the neighborhood. And he'd walk in and he'd flash that smile, and everybody'd be getting his autograph, and they'd completely forget what the agenda was, and
he knew how to have a good time too.
He was just such a great spirit, and he loved people, and so and that was infectious. And so it is interesting, actually, now when I walk into a room and I'm getting sort of a similar response. I think there's a part of me that can still step back from it, and part of what I want, actually, is for people to recognize that politics, it shouldn't be about personality, that it should be about agendas and moving things forward. And I'm glad that people, I think, get a sense from my campaign and from my interactions with them that I'm trustworthy and that I'm somebody who's on their side. But ultimately, I want them to know that I'm their employee, and that they can make demands on me, and I have an obligation to work hard on their behalf and not just, enjoy being a senator.
Right.
Yeah.
Before you went to Harvard Law School, which was right after Chicago, right?
Right.
You went back to Kenya.
Yeah.
For the first time.
Right.
To the small town where your dad had been raised, and you visited with his mom.
Right.
What was that like?
Well, that's how the book ends, is really my visit to Africa for the first time, and to really retrace my father's life, and then his father before him. And what it did for me, I think, was bring my life full circle, and it made me understand him and the struggles he had went through, because he was a sort of mythical figure. Although he had left me and my mother early, my mother continued to love and project all sorts of wonderful hopes and dreams on him. And what I came to realize was, here was a man who had gone from herding goats in a tiny village. I mean, town is a generous term. I mean, there's a few shacks out in the outskirts of Kenya, and had made that leap from a 15th century society to a 20th century society in the span of 10 or 15 years, and that there was a lot of stuff that he hadn't worked out. He hadn't worked out how to make that transition, and how do you take tradition and graft it onto the modern, and how do you deal with being part of a very localized and self-contained world, and suddenly you're in this global society, and there were a lot of pitfalls for him that he fell into, and so it made me, I think, much more forgiving of him and much more mindful of the connections between the struggles that he went through, the struggles that I had gone through, the struggles that African Americans and immigrants go through in this country. It made me understand that part of my story connected to this larger story of people who feel displaced and are trying to find their own identities and make their way in a modern world.
When you had that meal in the White House that David Letterman referred to as like Mardi Gras, were you thinking about your dad, your mom, your grandparents? That's pretty heady stuff, walking into the White House.
Well, it is, and I think that when I think about the struggles that my mother's family went through, small town Kansas, and working on oil rigs, never graduating from college, and what they were able to pass on to me, and when I think about even in his absence, what my father was able to pass on to me, and the distances that we've traveled, that's a powerful thing. It's something that is also humbling, and it gives me a sense of great responsibility, because I feel like I have to pass on to my children and my great-grandchildren and other people's children and grandchildren at least as great a gift.
How prepared are you for the honeymoon to end? Because you know, as well as anybody, that once you are in the job, you're in the Senate, and you have a voting record, it's a little harder than being the guy on the outside saying, no, we should do this, we shouldn't do that. Well, you ready for that?
Oh, I've assumed that it was going to happen 2 months ago. Or, the nice thing about having served in the state legislature is, I was serving in utter obscurity. When I was a community organizer, nobody knew my name. And so I wouldn't be in this work if I was in it just for the glitz and glamour and the fun of it. I really value the work, and that's what satisfies me. And I know how hard the work is. It's really hard to get people from diverse backgrounds, different economic stations, different cultures to agree to move forward on difficult problems. So I'm under no illusion that it's going to be simple. And I don't think really the voters are under that illusion either. I think what the voters expect from me is that I'm going to work hard, that I'm going to operate with integrity, that I'm going to keep them in mind first when I am casting votes. I don't think they assume that they're going to agree with me on everything, because in fact, if you look at the results of the election, there were 1 million people who voted for me and George Bush, and that means that they disagree with me on some things, and they also disagree with the president on some things. But the point is what they want is somebody, I think, who is going to be an honest representative, and that's what I'll try to do.
I know when anybody brings up the future and possibly being on a national ticket, you make a point of saying, look, I'm new, I'm concerned about the people of Illinois and all of that. But what would be so wrong with saying, you know what, at some point in the future, I think that would be pretty cool to be the president or the vice president. Why not? Well, why not just say that? There's no shame in having that ambition, is there?
No, I don't think there's any shame to it, but I think that I like keeping first things first. And what I've learned, at least what's worked for me so far, and maybe it won't work over the next 6 years, but what's worked for me so far is doing the job in front of me. If I do good work, then I think opportunities open up. And
you're not bothered by the fact that what the insiders say. He's got a high-powered agent, the book, the network appearances. He's really thinking about the future right now.
Yeah, you know, I know that's what people think, but keep in mind, I wrote that book 10 years ago. It's complete serendipity that, as a consequence of my election, you know, it's on the bestseller list. And, you know, part of the reason that, look, any author is gratified that people are finally going to read your book. And it doesn't hurt that it helps pay for my kids' college education, because I've been broke for the last 10 years. But so I'm grateful for it. But I really believe that if I do good work, then there are going to be opportunities out there. If I'm speaking to the concerns and issues of not only the people of Illinois, but the American people, and if I'm doing that in a effective way, then I think that I can get all kinds of stuff done. And so I'm wildly ambitious about getting good work done. I'm hugely ambitious about delivering health care to kids and to help people stabilize their retirement and making sure that young people have educational opportunity. And I figure if I help nudge, you know, move the ball down the field on those issues, then who knows?
So when you walked into the White House for the first time, you weren't thinking, yeah, I put the basketball court over there.
I wasn't. Thank you very much.
Great to have you here. I really
enjoyed
enjoyed it. Thanks so much. Good luck in Washington.
Thank you.
All the best to you and your family.
Good. I'm sure I'll be seeing quite a bit of you guys.
Hope so.
Thanks.
Thanks to Barack Obama, and that's it for the Friday Night Show. We'll be back live on Monday night with another edition of Chicago Tonight at 7 o'clock. Until then, for all of us on the late shift here at Channel 11, thanks for watching and have a great weekend.
Guest transportation for this program provided by AM's Limousine Service.
Closed captioning for this program is made possible by the generous support of Robert Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury firm.